I'm so happy today to be able to introduce Professor Sari Kerr, who some of us had the pleasure this most recent fall to have in class and to learn from and to learn with. So let's begin. Sari Kerr is a senior research scientist and program director at Wellesley College. Her current research interests are in the area of entrepreneurship, immigration, gender, and the labor market. Sari is primarily interested in how labor markets, along with policy and industrial conditions, shape the behavior of firms and the career trajectories of their employees. Many of the studies focus on the intersection of family life and workplace. She has recently testified in the United States Congress on the impact of immigration that entrepreneurs have in the United States economy. Her work is also frequently covered in popular media outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the Washington Post, and the Harvard Business Review. Sari Kerr received her PhD from the University of Finland in 2000. I won't try to pronounce it, but you can tell us a little more. After completing a postdoctoral fellowship at Economics Department of MIT, Sari spent several years as an economic consultant at the Charles River Association in Toronto and Boston. After returning back to academia, Sari started teaching economic courses at Boston University, MIT, and Wellesley College. Please welcome Sari.
It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Olga Shurchkov. She's a fellow, was originally a fellow Wellesley student and is now part of our alumna. After attending Wellesley, she received her PhD in economics from MIT and has now returned to Wellesley as a professor in the economics department. She currently teaches introductory and intermediate courses in macroeconomics, as well as a seminar on behavioral economics, so you still have the opportunity to maybe take her classes. Professor Shurchkov's research revolves around behavioral and experimental economics, with an emphasis on labor market outcomes, information, belief formation, learning, culture, and institutions. For example, she has studied gender differences in performance under competition and time pressure, appearance-based discrimination, and gender differences in leadership productivity. In addition to teaching and research, Professor Shurchkov is the director of the Knapp Social Science Center at Wellesley College. The center supports students and faculty research, provides a rich and engaging program of events, and supports innovative approaches to teaching. Apart from academic pursuits, she also enjoys practicing and teaching Taekwondo and is a 5th degree black belt, so don't mess with her. Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Shurchkov.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. And Anne, always a very hard act to follow, so I'm going to do my best. But actually, I will out you a little bit more because Anne was my professor in intermediate microeconomics.
She was very smart.
Not too long ago, because I'm very young. No, okay. All right. So I will tell you a little bit about my research and also other research that relates to gender differences in the workplace, and hopefully you'll find this evidence useful. So as Anne mentioned, women and men earn about the same numbers of degrees. In fact, women earn more degrees at all levels. So not just the undergraduate degrees, but also masters and PhDs. And also women represent nearly 1/2 of the labor force, although that number has been decreasing recently in the US. So that's a concern in and itself. But as we already know, women earn about 80 cents on the dollar, the uncontrolled gap, so to speak, that Anne mentioned. And these gaps are global, right? This is not just the US, but in developed economies, even ones that do a much bigger, go into much bigger pushes in policy to try to close these gaps, like Sweden, right? These countries still experience these gender gaps. So, so the EU average is about 16%, right? So also, as again Anne mentioned, these pay gaps really vary quite strongly along occupational lines and industry lines. So, for example, women in full-time management, professional and related occupation earn even less on the dollar than men. So in other words, it sort of goes the wrong way. In the highest paid positions, women are earning even less than men.
And so again, this is showing up in leadership as well. So for example, in Fortune 500 companies, if we look at the entry-level jobs, if you look kind of at the bottom of the pyramid, then women and men are represented about equally in these companies. But then as we move up through the ranks in the organization, all the way up to the CEO level, of course, the number of women dwindles with these higher and higher levels. And I was thinking about where else to kind of show you what industry to really zoom in on to show you these gender gaps. And I could show you many things. I could show you, for example, major choices in college in STEM. And women are, on average in the US, like, 20%. Right, of STEM majors on average. I know it's hard to believe at Wellesley, right, because we're 100% in everything. But across the country, it's quite different. What I am showing you here, though, is the gender gap in politics. Because, Albright Institute, right? Leadership, I don't know. You guys are majoring in everything, so it was hard to choose. But they're there, right? But here in politics, for example, if we look at governors, 10% of governors are women, senators, 21%, right? So major gaps in politics as well. And actually, so the introduction, I'm directing the SNAP Social Science Center, and we're bringing a journalist and an author here. She's not a Wellesley alum, but she's related to a Wellesley alumna, Caitlin Moscatello, and she is going to tell us a little bit more about how that is actually changing and how women are shaping the landscape in politics and in campaigning. So she's coming in March. So look out for my spams, please, for that event. I think it will be really nice to see that. All right. So again, right, we want to explain these gaps, especially the gaps in terms of like occupational selection. And that's really what I work on. Why are women not persisting in these kind of STEM careers, STEM majors, right? Okay. So in terms of explaining the persistence of these gender gaps, and as we can see again, right, these gender gaps are the largest in the highest paid industries like financial services and surgeons and legal industries. So, and the key insight from that I sort of accrued over time, I think, is that to get promoted and to get a pay raise in these different occupations, there are two ways to do that, right? First one is obviously to be good at your job, and that, we're all good at our jobs, right? Have great ideas. And so performance is important. For performance, we have to have good ideas, right? And that is inherent. Right, we already, Wellesley students all have great ideas, great performers, right? But more importantly, we have to voice these ideas, right? And that is something different from inherent ability, right? We might have great ideas, but we might not be willing to voice them in particular settings, especially in male-dominated settings. So the differences we observe these differences, right, in the willingness of women to contribute ideas, right, in these especially male-dominated industries. Are these inherent or are these societal? It's very difficult to answer this question. My answer to you, I think, is like pretty clearly there's something about society, about stereotypes, as I'll tell you a little bit later in the talk. Okay. Secondly, in addition to voicing your ideas, you have to be recognized for your ideas. Right, that's the second part. First of all, we have to recognize our own ideas and that they're good enough for us to, self-promote, for us to say, I deserve this promotion, I deserve this raise, right? That is also something different from voicing ideas. They have to be like, recognize me, right? And that is something about preferences again, right? This is something about, am I willing to negotiate based on my previous performance, right, for a raise, right? So that's kind of like going back to this determinant there. But a separate part from that is to be recognized by others. And it is a completely different channel. And here is where discrimination can come in, right? Is that maybe men that are otherwise completely the same as women in the workforce, who have the same ideas, the same education, and the same willingness to voice these ideas, right, are just not recognized at the same rate as men are, right? That's where discrimination might come in. So in my research, what I do is I run experiments in the lab online and field experiments that try to disentangle these two sources of the gender gap, right? And you can kind of imagine that it's really difficult to use observational data, right, to try to understand these mechanisms, right? Because in the survey data, all we see is the gender gap. We can't really be like a fly on the wall in a team meeting in a company where like a woman is being mansplained to, right? Or her idea is being stolen. It's very difficult to actually as a researcher to observe these things. So what I do is I set up these kind of more stylized environments in the lab, right, to try to observe men and women, brainstorming men and women trying to contribute, right? And then who is selected? Who is the person who gets rewarded, right? Okay, and so what I find is that really it's all about stereotypes. The answers to our questions begin there, right? The way I do this in the lab is that I ask subjects what kind of task is perceived or believed to be more female-oriented, right? Even if it's in reality it's completely the same for men and women. What do we think women are good at? And what do we think men are good at, right? And it turns out that those are different things, okay? People in general, right, on average, perceive math-based tasks as more male-oriented, unfortunately, and kind of more verbal, more communication-based tasks as more female-oriented, okay? And again, I want to emphasize that even though this is not true, these stereotypes are incorrect in most of these settings and most of the tasks that I use, like these words in the word task, for example, is not actually one where women are better than men. No, they're about the same. And similarly, these math tasks that I use are not more suited for men. Women are the same. There's a perception, and that's what's important. Just like kind of in the real world, when we all look at these two pictures, just try to introspect. What pops into your head when you look at the picture on the left? Who is that person? Who is that? A medical doctor. And what's the perception of the right picture? Who is that? A nurse. I know that we want to resist this, right? And that's our training. That's our it's our Wellesley societal, whatever training. But our gut immediately somehow jumps to these stereotypes, okay? And you know what's actually really crazy is that I really tried to control for age in my Googling of these pictures. I was like, I want to try to find the same age, man and woman, and they're both wearing kind of scrubs or whatever. You can't find a young man doctor stereotype, and you cannot find an older woman stereotype, right? So it's very weird that even on the internet these stereotypes are persisting. Okay, so based on these kind of more male-oriented domains and female-oriented domains, we see a lot of gendered outcomes, okay? One outcome that I always see is that women tend to shy away from competing in male-stereotyped environments, okay? And what we call this kind of phenomenon is stereotype threat. As soon as we stereotype ourselves, or we perceive that others will stereotype us, we are going to behave differently. For example, is to shy away from competing, okay? In other words, equally capable women are discouraged from entering the race, right? Entering a tournament where they can earn more, right? Rather than when they're not competing. Similarly, female managers tend to shy away from assigning incentives to their workers that are more competitive, right? They assign incentives, in other words, they pay their workers based not on relative performance to others, but based on something else, okay? And so what are the explanations? Well, you can think of many. What do you guys think? Is this just inherent that women, tend to shy away from competing? Or what do we think? No, nope. What do you think that might be about?
I also do research in Stereotype Threat.
Great.
So, but in terms of gender, meaning in non-binary children. So in the perspective that you have it's a lot of data based on how stereotypes can produce some sort of anxiety, and it kind of gets into the person's brain, and therefore they're not allowed to perform their best. So basically, it really affects the person when they're told, oh, you're not good at math because you're a woman. Therefore, you put that into your brain and you don't perform as well as men.
Perfect, right. And that can affect your confidence, right? A lot. And that can affect your willingness to take risks. And also quite rationally, I think in the workforce, right, you could expect a certain level of backlash maybe against you not conforming to your gender stereotype, right? And competing, right? Doing something that is more kind of stereotypically a male act. Right? So these are all the reasons that were mentioned, exactly. Fear of backlash and strategic reasons, I think, is a big deal as well. Okay, what about leading, right? So in other words, putting yourself up for leading a team. That's another really important thing, right? Where we want to self-promote to become managers, right? Again, right, in male-type domains, in the presence of stereotype threat and in sort of gender stereotypes, equally capable women shy away from contributing ideas in team brainstorming settings. Equally capable potential leaders also do not self-promote as much. Again, for the same reasons, right, that they worry about backlash. They worry about not conforming to their gender stereotype. And there's also discrimination that sort of taking aside the fact that we ourselves are self-stereotyping and perhaps not putting ourselves up for the job. Also, others tend to not promote us. Okay. Now, what actually is interesting, my most recent research is that free-form communication in these team kind of oriented environments actually hurts women. And the reason is because of the way that we are also stereotyped to communicate differently. Okay, women are stereotyped to be warmer, okay, in our communication styles. And men, in my research, in my setting, tend to think that men are more competent and they have more confident and assertive ways of communicating. Now, what it turns out to then lead to is that warmth is not rewarded in terms of being promoted, okay? Which, by the way, is completely wrong because warmth is actually quite a productive trait for men or women. Okay, so it's actually the most productive way to communicate in a team setting is to be warm. Doesn't matter if you're a man or woman, right? But warmth is not rewarded. But competency, right, and assertiveness, the male traits, stereotypically male traits, are rewarded. So that's a kind of a sad realization also that I have. Negotiating, right? So negotiating, just like the act of negotiating, is a male-type task. Kind of like, right, men are perceived to be more willing to negotiate. And it turns out that it's actually true. Women do shy away from negotiating, all right? Survey evidence, there's a book that's Women Don't Ask, right? The title is Women Don't Ask. And it is true that women tend to report much lower willingness to enter negotiations. Women, on average, right, tend to kind of leave money on the table when it comes to entry-level jobs if they are allowed to negotiate. So, and so if we look at, like, for example, MBAs, right, 57% of MBAs coming out of a program, for example, this one is Carnegie Mellon, 57% negotiated for their salary, when only 7% of women negotiate. So we do see these gender differences, and of course, again, going back, right, to these explanations that stereotype threat holds us from entering in the particularly beneficial financial and otherwise situations. Okay, so what helps us to kind of like, this is all very depressing. I didn't mean for it to be depressing, but it is still, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So what helps? In terms of willingness to lead and willingness to compete, a lot of interventions have been tried. For example, stereotypes being reversed is helpful, right? If you can just reverse the stereotype, right? If we cannot stereotype STEM jobs to be male-oriented, like that would help. It's hard to do, no? But it works. But importantly, I will point one out. When share of women increases in the organization, immediately women start to sort of self-promote more, right? Start to speak up on their own behalf more. And these women don't even have to be role models, right? Like just seeing other women like us, right, in the organization is helpful. Okay. In terms of negotiating, I will point out the one that is the most helpful is transparency. For women, when they perceive that it's sort of allowed, quote unquote, to negotiate and that it is expected, right? If we just change the structure of a firm, that it's not like in the back room that these negotiations, or like at the bar these negotiations happen, but really it's completely transparent that, women and men, workers are allowed to negotiate for their salary raises and so on, then women do this because that kind of takes away the chance of backlash. Okay, let me summarize here. So why did I put this picture up on the screen? It's because I actually, like, when I was doing this research, I sort of inadvertently did my own experiment on Facebook. And because I had a professional photo shoot here at Wellesley, and I was trying to, like, pick, which of these pictures to put on my profile. And you can see that the one on the left is sort of more serious and the one on the right has a smile, I don't know. And on Facebook, I generated like hundreds of comments when I was asking people, right, to say like which one I should choose. And it's sort of like this typical divide, right? Warmer, more approachable versus competent. I mean, why does it have to be versus, right? And yet it basically my own experiment, like I lived it on Facebook. And that's the question, do we want to live up to our gender stereotype and embrace it? Or in the workforce, do we like kind of go with the one that's more male stereotype, right? And so, women are expected to be warm, and less competent, unfortunately, than men, right? So what do? Do we shut down our warmth and sort of change ourselves? Well, do we suppress the traits? It's a really, really complicated thing, okay? I chose the more serious picture, but I mean, in my daily life, I don't go against my smiley face. You just can't, right? And it's just not worth it. But I know that young women in professional world tend to be stereotyped, and sometimes you want to choose, one way or the other. But it is complicated because, again, as I mentioned, warmth is actually effective. It's a very effective trait as part of a team environment. All right, so why do we suppress it? Makes no sense. Okay. And then in my main mantra, sort of as like an implication of my research, is that we should not go towards changing women. That should not be what we do, okay? And we should not force them all to lean in. Women know when to lean in, right? Okay. And then there's also the idea that there could be backlash. So, that it's as complicated. What I will say, though, is that self-stereotyping, I also have some work on misattribution of feedback, negative and positive feedback by women. It results in competent women shying away, right, from male-type domains. And, the organization itself loses out and we lose out. And these sort of self-stereotyping and stereotype threat is greatly reduced through peer networks when there's more women in the job, right, and with role models and mentoring. And so I'll leave you with this final thought of like sort of on what it takes. It's about fighting stereotypes, but also importantly, finding a way for the institutions to allow us not to have to lean in, but also to allow men to lean out. Because just like there are gender stereotypes against us as women in male-type domains, there are similarly stereotypes against men in female-type domains. And so until we stop that, right, gender gaps cannot be reversed. So thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much for both of these great introductions to the topic. I'm so glad to have a couple of my students here who know a lot of this. We've spent a whole semester covering sort of this idea of women in the economy and in the workplace. And so 20 minutes is a very, very short time, as my students know, to try to get some of this crammed in. But I'll do my best. And the evidence I'll show you today is from the US. It's a very different setting than what Olga was talking about. So Olga is doing these very detailed lab studies, basically, where she studies individual people and specific behaviors. My data is essentially all workers in all US firms. It lives in the Census Bureau's deep data archives, and I will say that everything that I will show you is very comprehensive. So this is, I can follow all of these people over time, and it's sort of very interesting what we can find out. And in particular, I'll talk about the age dynamics of gender earnings differential. So we can follow people right as they graduate and then see them as they move along in their careers and as they start families and make other choices. So starting from, I guess, where Anne was, these are the types of statistics we tend to see on the gender pay gap. It doesn't really matter whether it's 79 cents or whether it's 92 cents, or whether it's a lot of dollars or generally just women tend to make less money than men, pretty much anywhere you look at it. The gap varies, that we know. And what are the reasons? Again, Olga covered some of these reasons. Is it women are not competing, they're not negotiating? Are they getting the wrong kind of education? Do employers and team members have implicit biases that are working against women? Do women make terrible choices that cost them a lot of money, like getting married and having children? Or is it sort of this costly job amenities there, which means that we basically need a job. If I'm a mother of 2 children, I need a job where I can actually like take a day off when one of them is sick and the school calls and says you have to come and get your kid. That is a costly job amenity. I can't be in consulting because that's it just doesn't work that way in many careers where you can just leave and stay home for a day. Many of these things probably working simultaneously. I'm not trying to kind of parse out all of those things. So what I'm really trying to get to is to look at the job itself. So a lot of the stuff happens after we leave college. We pick a job. You kind of enter a field, whether it's a STEM field or whether it's teaching or whatever your sort of job kind of is, and then you can move along your career. You may stay in that job for a long time. My mom is one of those generations. She actually stayed in the same job her entire life until she retired. That's very rare these days. So you'll probably have multiple job changes, and you sort of have to think about along the way, like you get job offers. Should you take that? Should you not take that? Your choices may change over time. So what we find is that there's a very significant increase in the gender pay gap as people age. We look at ages from 25 to 45, and that tends to be the period where most of that earnings growth happens in a person's career, and then after 45, things start to kind of stagnate. We find that happens because, first of all, initially, men and women sort into different kind of firms. First of all, we sort into lower-paying sectors as women, and then even within any sector, women tend to sort into a lower-paying firm than the men do. That explains a little bit of the pay gap. And then within those firms, as people stay, or get promoted, get pay raises, there's a lot of differential earnings growth that happens within every kind of job. And so what we did is basically took anyone we can find in the U.S. firms. We track them throughout their career, see them moving jobs, and then it sounds pretty simple. We just decompose these age earnings profiles into something you can sort of think about promotions. That is the within firm earnings changes as you stay with your current employer. Then there are job changes. So some people sort of manage to increase their earnings by changing jobs into always a little bit of a better paying job. And then there are those other components. It took 3 days to run that decomposition. And so it sounds easy. It was pretty complicated. So I'll show you some graphs, but I'll cover the main findings. And this sort of, to me, this wasn't terribly surprising. What was a little bit surprising was how surprised a lot of the journalists and a lot of the audience was about it, that everyone was very shocked to hear that there's a very massive pay gap increase from age 25 to 45, especially for the college educated, not so much for the non-college educated. That mostly happens within jobs, so people stay with their firm, men just increase their earnings at a much more rapid pace. And the remaining part, 27% of that increase in the gap, comes from men switching to more advantageous jobs over time, whereas women don't. And then in those job changes, I think that this is interesting too. It mostly or only really happens among married individuals. So unmarried individuals seem to behave very differently than married individuals. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then just the no college group, nothing much is happening there. It's almost the same as Anne was earlier talking about some of those racial gaps. It's not because the non-college women are doing fantastically. It's mostly because the non-college men are doing pretty terribly, and so the gap never increases very much. The lifetime earnings trajectories of non-college men are pretty flat. Okay. So this is, I'll show you some sort of trickier graphs. I think we should focus on that. Let's see if I have, yes, I do. So this is the kind of college grad line I want to focus on right now. So think about this data point here as the moment when my college grads just graduate and get their first job. And so what happens? This is the pay gap here and it's all negative because women never make more money than men, right? So always pay gap is always negative. Women start their careers roughly at a minus 10 point of whatever men make. So they make 90% of the men's male earnings. And that comes from a couple of things. So it comes from the fact that women are more likely to be focused on those pink collar occupations, and pink collar occupations pay less than some of the more traditional male occupations. And then also within any given sector, even if they are in the same sector, women are more likely to be in the lower paying firms. So that's fine. So it's a sort of that we can pretty much explain away. And then what happens over the next sort of 20 years or a little over of their time is that we have a very rapid kind of increase in the pay gap that then tends to settle down at sort of towards the end of the time period we look at here. And that is drastic. So we sort of end up, and these are logarithmic gaps, and we've tried to translate them into, apparently journalists don't like logarithmic gaps. I don't know why. It seems like perfectly reasonable way to think about it for me. We translated it that by the time that men and women are 45, the college-educated men make about 55% more than college-educated women annually, and here, that is a pretty drastic gap. So if we think we can think about it in different ways. I don't know. This one is sort of makes sense to me. Now we don't know yet where that comes from. That's just the overall change in the earnings gap from about 25, 27 to 45. So here we start to get a little bit like, let's try to sort of look at this in different kinds of ways. So first, again, now I'm sort of trying to get away from the logarithms and benchmark things for you a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit easier to understand if people do not love logarithms. We're now using these non-college educated women at age 25 to benchmark. So this line should start exactly at 1. And then comparing everyone to that data point. So college-educated men immediately start their sort of earnings careers at they make 1.5 times what non-college-educated women do, and then we see this very rapid increase. Their age earnings profile is steeply increasing, and then sort of starts to slow down, as Anne mentioned earlier. The increase stops after age 40, roughly. But then by the time they're there, they already earn like 3 times what non-college-educated women do. And this is just the average. If you look at the upper end of that range, it would be in tens of times more. The same does not happen for college-educated women. We start our careers sort of this is not a huge difference here, maybe like 1.3 times more than the non-college educated women, but then like almost nothing happens, right? So we somehow miss out on that massive increase. There's a little bit of an age earnings profile there, but definitely not that dramatic. And the no college group, again, nothing too big happening for them, as I mentioned. And so now I'll sort of show you the within job. I'm sort of using the fact that some people stay in their jobs for a long time, whereas other people switch jobs. And so think about the group that these guys are all staying in their jobs for a long time. And here I'm just benchmarking everyone to themselves to sort of make this a little bit more tractable. Sort of within any given job, we see this very, very similar, looks very similar to me than the previous line, basically, for college-educated men. A rapid increase in earnings within a given job continues throughout their sort of peak prime working career. And again, very similar to me to the previous ones, or maybe it's a little bit less sort of curvy here for the college-educated women, but clearly that gap opens simply because men are getting promoted more. There could be a lot of the stuff that Olga mentioned. Maybe they're doing more negotiating over their annual pay raises. Maybe they're saying, I got this other job offer. If you want me to stay, you have to pay me more. There may be a lot of that kind of stuff going on in there. There also, and I'll again get back to this in a minute, there's probably also the fact that women do take time off work. And we have some more new evidence on that even if they stay within the same employer, they may have taken a few big gaps from work. Then this is just the sort of job changing component. I'm only focusing on the college graduates right now and thinking about so why do people change jobs? Well, sometimes they change jobs because they got a better offer. Sometimes they change jobs because they got laid off, fired, and they need to find a new job. I think my own example, I changed jobs when I was in consulting. And as Anne mentioned, there's a lot of attrition from consulting firms. It's kind of fun to work, 80 hours a week, 100 hours a week with a team for a while, and it's very dynamic and exciting. But when you start thinking about having a family, maybe need a little bit less dynamic and exciting, because no one can potentially have a family and do that at the same time. So a lot of the job changes for women don't tend to be thinking, like especially at the sort of age when they start families, don't necessarily tend to be in the mind of trying to move up in the trajectory, but moving into jobs that allow them more temporal flexibility, allow them sort of amenities like flex time, paid time off, all kinds of other things that are then not paid as well. But what this graph is trying to show you is basically by marital status, we see this is sort of we can think about, again, this similar kind of age earnings profile, but this part is just coming from the job change component. So people are changing jobs and what is happening to their earnings throughout their lifetime. So married men seem to be sort of changing jobs and increasing earnings through those job changes on average. Non-married men, actually, in this job change component, if you look at them, they seem to be doing the same. So for men, it doesn't matter whether they're married or not. The job changes on average tend to be earnings enhancing. For women, this is the non-married women, this line here. They seem to behave roughly like men. Like there's a bit of a difference there, but not necessarily a big difference. They sort of enjoy earnings increases as they change jobs, whereas the married women are sort of the flatlining here at the bottom. Very few of them make job changes that are sort of earnings enhancing, and so that while this is not the major job changes is not the major explanation for why gender earnings gap grows over time or as people age, but it does contribute clearly and mostly through this married group. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about what some of this means. And so like, why does this happen? There's a theory. It's actually a very reasonable theory. The theory is thinking about especially sort of formation of households and how households make different decisions, right? So if you form a household, you have potentially initially two earners, and then the two earners have to decide how they spend their time, whether they will both focus on market activities, whether some of them will take on more home activities, whether they will buy, cleaning services and dinners from outside the home or make that at home. And then that, of course, depends. For any normal family, they'll think about how much good they make if they focus more on work versus how effective they are at doing these household things at home. And just if it so happens, as it happens in many, many households where there's a male and a female, that the male on average makes a little bit more than the female, then it may be more advantageous to have that male do more of the earning outside of the household, because every hour of his time brings in a little bit more money than what she could make. And so many households make that choice, especially around the time when they start having children. So then that actually accumulates quite radically over time. So then we get to these sort of lost promotion opportunities you noted earlier. We get to in general, sort of everything tends to sort of accumulate more and more over time. If one person is more career-focused, the other person is more home-focused, it is very hard for the home-focused person to suddenly swap into being the career-focused person. And so that's, I think, is exactly what's going on here in the data. So we saw the marital status explains a lot. If I did the same thing by looking the exact timing when a kid arrives in this household, I can compare couples. I can see married, highly educated couples as before they have a kid. They actually both look extremely similar. They sort of track along the same earnings trajectory, same labor force participation trajectory. The second the kid comes along, the male keeps tracking along exactly the same trajectory, keeps working exactly at the same rate as you would expect based on his age, keeps making, perhaps even increases the earnings a little bit relative to what you would expect. The female has a giant sharp drop in participation in earnings that lasts for a little bit, and then she creeps up a tiny little bit over time, but not a ton, right? Never ever recovers from having that first child, and it's not just a US-based finding. It happens in the Scandinavian countries where you have the best possible, like almost free childcare, all these long paid leaves, everything you can imagine. You can see it everywhere. So there's something quite dramatic about that I haven't. So part of it is sort of this. We can think about the household specialization. Some of it is probably just partly biological, makes sense for the mother of a young child to specialize in the care of that young child initially, but some of it is sort of coming from the societal expectations. Some of it is coming from employer views. So mothers of young children are not viewed to be promotion or sort of executive material and may not be promoted at the same rate. There's a lot of things that happen. And so for me, I think from here, the most interesting question is sort of, so what should we do? What should families do? What should firms do? What should public policies be looking like in the view of this? Like, people obviously make choices, and that is fine, but can we help them that their choices don't have to be quite so stark if we, for example, have public policies in place that allow for an easier combination of working life and family? And myself, I don't know, it's kind of almost pathetic. I teach this. I know all the theories, and I have I have a PhD in this thing, and I study large data sets that include all the people in the whole country. And so I figured, like, surely, like, I can, if someone can figure this out in their life, then I can certainly, like, it's like I should be reasonably well equipped, I would say. And so I was like married another PhD, and so I was actually making more money than him initially because he chose to be a professor. I was in consulting. Then we started to think about this, like, childcare situation. Bill was in tenure track at the moment, and I was like, well, this consulting is kind of, it's a bit much, so I should maybe I'll go back to academia. So I swapped. I took I think I took roughly about 100% pay cut or something, felt like at the time. But it was fine. I thought it was worth the choice, and I do love being in academia, so I have no regrets there. And then we have we were trucking along reasonably well and sharing household chores and everything equally. And then we had our first kid, and then the wheels came off. and then I did not quit my job. I did do my 3 months of maternity leave and then came back to work. Bill said he felt like the caveman after the first kid came along. He felt like, must go earn beef, and sort of like he said he thought that he would be more of a modern father who sort of participates equally in everything, but for some reason he felt like his role was to just go out there, catch the mammoth, and like bring it home. And I had such a struggle because I felt like I was failing on every potential dimension. I was supposed to be home with this poor infant, and what was I doing? This is a complete struggle. And then if you look at us now, we have our kids are almost 9 and 6. I think we look exactly like the stupid data, and I'm very annoyed with it because I knew it. I should have maybe planned better, or maybe I shouldn't have. But I will say that some of the policies certainly are set up in such a way, and our sort of society is set up in such a way that it is very hard to struggle against some of these things that exist there, because that's just the way this works. And again, I feel like at least I'm trying to do the service to others to say how this looks like. And you can go out there and be educated and know what to expect. And if you're still willing to make crazy choices like have a spouse and a child, and then at least you know what it's going to cost you. But I don't have the solution. And as you can, if I did have the perfect solution, I would do it. I do think there's a lot inside these firms that need to be happening. And many firms are becoming much more recognizing of this issue. They don't want to lose women from the pipeline. There's a lot of talent that gets lost if we don't encourage young women to stay on and promote them and sort of, I love seeing that. And I think also public policy has a role to play. In my opinion, the paid leave discussion is great, but turns out that if you have a kid and you get 3 months of paid leave, the kid is not ready to leave the house at this point. So there has to be something that happens at 3 months that allows the mother to continue their working careers beyond that. But I thank you, and I hope you learn a lot today.
Sari and Olga to take the chairs on the stage, and we'll do a little Q&A. But I wanted to add a little bit of summarizing and reflection to what we've heard. It's easy, if you aren't an economist, to think about economics as having a whole lot to do with numbers and not a whole lot to do with human behavior. And I think that when you listen to not just the data that were presented, but the stories that frame them, you really recognize that this question about how much women earn is about the intersection of a whole bunch of factors. It's about directly productivity-related attributes that men and women have. It's about the characteristics of jobs, right? If you want to be in consulting, and do you have to work 80 hours a week? And why did the world decide that that was a thing, right? Why do we think that investment banking has to happen at night? I don't know why we think that, right? But I think that's an important trait. And it brings into play your own home life. Because the thing that I can tell you as a 58-year-old woman is that the single most important career decision you will make is who you choose to be your life partner. Nothing is more important about your career than who the other person in that room is. I out-earn my husband by a significant margin. And somebody asked him how he felt about that once. And he said, quote, "I like it because I'm an economist and more is better," right? But there are definitely households in which that wouldn't be true. That conversation that Sari just said about the woolly mammoth, we have a picture in my house of my husband trying to give my son a bath. When my son was 9 months old, the first time my husband tried to give my son a bath was when my son was 9 months old, because he was so afraid that he would drown the child. And I said to him, I'm also afraid. He said, "You're afraid that you would drown?" I was like, "Yes, I'm not going to wash the baby with my uterus. There is nothing in my biology that makes me unable to let a baby slip underwater. It's just the baby is dirty. Someone needs to wash the baby. I know that it has to be me." And so I think that one of the things we need to think about, you need to think about, is who the other person in the room is and how openly you can converse about what your expectations are about what's going to happen when this child comes. My husband does carpool. He always did carpool. I never did carpool. I didn't arrange them. I didn't drive them. I didn't participate in them because I'm not a big fan of other people's children. But I think that's an important conversation to have, because when you look at these data and you see, right, that you graduate from college and then everything just goes to hell in a handbasket, right? That has to do with something about not only the choices we make individually, but the choices we make socially. And I do believe that the more women there are in the room, the more reasonable it eventually will become to say, actually, I don't need to do this work between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. I can go home and come back in the morning and do it then. Make sense?